Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In the third of his letters to a German friend, Albert Camus is going to delve into a divergence in the conception of what Europe is, what it means, what its sense or meaning, sens in French, could be. And there's a certain point in there where he's going to say, as it's translated, there is no common denominator between the way that we see things, those of us who have suffered and who don't buy into the Nazi frame of mind, and those who are in fact supporting the Nazi regime, arguing for it, serving it. And in French it's il n'y a pas de commune mesure, which is an interesting way of talking about it. There's an incommensurability, if we want to be quite literal about it, meaning that in a certain way, his Nazi former friend cannot understand the perspective that Camus is articulating, although Camus can understand but not agree with or assent to the position that his Nazi friend has. And he begins by saying, "Until now I've been talking to you of my country, and you must have thought in the beginning that my tone had changed from when they used to be friends before the war. In reality, this was not so. It is merely we didn't give the same meaning to the same words. We no longer speak the same language." So perhaps at one time they did speak a shared or common language, but now that's no longer available. And it's sort of what, in linguistic terms, we call a shibboleth, meaning where the sense of a term is very different from one community to the other. And we see this all the time. I'll just give you one example from contemporary American politics. Actually, I'll give you two. One that we've had for a long time, freedom, right? Everybody's for freedom, but what exactly does freedom mean? Does it mean the freedom to do this, the freedom to do that? The freedom to not have to join a union and be fired or hired at the whim of an employer. What a great freedom that is. Some people think that is an awesome freedom. Others are like, yeah, it's great. That's the freedom to starve, not a great freedom at all. Even the notion of America. What is it to be an American, right? Some people associate it with some universal ideals. Other people associate it with being of a certain ethnicity, and it's always a shrinking sort of conception, we could say, with room for the good ones of that other who might be incorporated as token members of a community. Very, very different conceptions being named by the same word. So Camus is going to talk about two terms. One he mentions very briefly, because he's already talked about it a good bit in terms of country in the previous two letters, and that is what's translated as fatherland, patrie, which makes sense. It's coming from the Latin term pater, which means father. Actually, patria in Latin is the same thing as patrie in French. But another translation that I think helps us wrap our head around it, great translation of patrie into contemporary English, homeland. Our homeland, right? And he says that the way that you use that term It assumes blind and bloody overtones that make it forever alien to me. Whereas we, the French, have put it into the same word, the flame of an intelligence that makes courage more difficult and gives man complete fulfillment. And he says, so the tone hasn't really changed. The one I used before 1939, before the beginning of the war, is the one I'm using today. And then he switches to what the letter is really about, Europe. What does Europe mean? So he says, during all the time when we were obstinately and silently serving our country, we never lost sight of an idea and a hope forever present in us, that of Europe. So not just France, not just his country, but of Europe as a larger whole that France is a part of. And he says, we haven't talked about Europe much these last 5 years, but that's because you talked about it too much. So it became a word that the Nazis used, thinking about Festung Europa, the fortress Europe concept that they had. And so he says, before telling you what our conception of Europe is, I want to insist that among the reasons we have for fighting you, there's perhaps none more fundamental than our awareness of having been not only mutilated in our country, wounded in our flesh, but divested of our most beautiful images. You gave the word Europe a hateful and ridiculous version, a mockery. The idea of Europe you took from the best of us and then distorted has consequently become hard for us to keep alive in all of its original force. So what do the Nazis actually mean by Europe? Well, Camus says, you think of it as a property, propriété, something that you can own, something that becomes yours by conquering it, right? And he says, you never actually spoke this way until you lost Africa. It's not the right kind of love that you actually have. You view Europe as a property. We feel that we belong to it. We have duties to Europe, not just Europe is there for us. And he says, you say Europe, what do you actually mean by it? You think in terms of potential soldiers, people that you can draw upon. This is indeed what the Nazis did. They appropriated not just the military materials like trucks and tanks and, anti-aircraft guns from the conquered countries and the gold reserves, but also the population, some of whom they used on the Eastern Front, throwing in to fight against the Soviets, almost all of whom died or went into the gulags as POWs. And so he goes on and says, you think of soldiers, granaries, literally granary de blé, wheat granaries, industries that have been brought to heel or domesticated, meaning they took the French industry and made it serve the German state, intelligence under control. And he says, am I going too far? I know when you say Europe, even in your best moments, you can't keep yourself from thinking about a cohort of docile nations. So there are a lot of other nations in Europe led by a lordly Germany, a Germany who's in charge towards a fabulous and bloody future. And he says, I'd like you to be aware of this difference. For you, Europe is an expanse circled by seas and mountains, dotted with dams, gutted with mines, covered with harvests, where Germany is playing a game in which her own fate alone is at stake. Now, what is a contrast to that? A Europe in which one country is not running the entire show, where there's a plurality, where there's difficulties, but there's also respect and perhaps even justice. So he says, for us, Europe is going to be something different. It's the home of the spirit, or the mind, where for the last 20 centuries, the most amazing adventure of the human spirit has been going on. It is the privileged arena in which Western man's struggle against the world, against the gods, against himself is today reaching its climax. And here's where he says, there is no common denominator between the way you see Europe and the way we see Europe. And then he's going to bring up something really quite interesting. He says, I'm not going to use propaganda. And the propaganda in this case would be talking about the Christian tradition. And Camus says, yeah, I can't do that because I don't buy into it. It's not my tradition. It's not that he doesn't read Christian authors or anything like that, but you Nazis have also kind of ruined it. You've talked too much of it, and posing as defenders of Rome, you were not afraid to give Christ the kind of publicity. He began to be accustomed to the day he received the kiss that marked him for torture. And he says, there's another reason, though, too. The Christian tradition is only one that has formed Europe. So it certainly played a role. He's not denying that, even though he doesn't himself, affiliate himself with it. But he talks about there being another tradition. He says that when I allow myself to think my country speaks in the name of Europe, and when we defend one, we are defending both, I too have my tradition. So what is this other tradition that Camus is accepting? Is it a secularist tradition? No, it's something different, perhaps transcending them. He says it's a tradition both of a few great individuals and of an inexhaustible mass. My tradition, here he talks about two aristocracies, two types of greatness, right? That of the intelligence and that of courage. It has its intellectual leaders associated with intelligence and its innumerable mass. And he says this is something different than the colored spot you've annexed on temporary maps. So two very, very different conceptions of Europe at play here, which are incommensurable. Then he brings up a conversation, or conversations rather, that he had with his friend in the past, where his friend was saying you have to choose one or the other, and you can't possibly have both. So Don Quixote or Faust. Faust, if you remember, is the subject of a play, Faust, right? And in that play, Faust makes a deal with the devil for all sorts of power. It doesn't make him actually happy as he'd like to be, but he has immense power. And the German friend said, if Don Quixote, who's this, very important representative of the Romantic period and its foibles, Don Quixote is powerless if Faust feels like attacking him. And Camus' response to this is, why the hell are you having them attack each other? That's not what art is supposed to be doing. He says, neither Faust nor Don Quixote was intended to attack the other. Art was not invented to bring evil into the world. You used to like exaggerated images and you continued your argument. So now we get another two important figures. According to you, there was a choice between Hamlet, figure Shakespeare's play, or Siegfried, the great hero, who is also doomed, by the way, of the Nibelungenlied. And Camus says, you don't actually have to choose between these. I didn't want to choose, and it didn't seem to me that the West could exist if you do have to choose. Now, why would you want to get away from Hamlet? Well, Hamlet himself can't make decisions. If you ever read Hamlet, almost everybody dies in the play. Siegfried is this very heroic figure. Actually, he's done in eventually by Hagen, who learns about his vulnerability in the end. And Camus is going to say, these are unnecessary conflicts. He says, the West couldn't exist except in the equilibrium between strength and knowledge. You scorned knowledge and spoke only of strength, and even the strength isn't going to be of use to you as you are now losing. So even Faust won't be helpful to you. And he says, our choice We're going to have to decide ourselves. We're going to try to bring these things together that you tried to separate out and to repress. And he says, your Europe is not the right one. Why? There's nothing there to unite or inspire. And here he says something quite interesting. He says, ours is a joint adventure. Literally, adventure commune. It's something that we all share in common with each other, that we shall continue to pursue despite you. So that's an important section. And then Camus says something really interesting, having to do with what our attitude ought to be towards the good things that we think about in terms of, in this case, Europe, but we could think about other places as well, and the fact that somebody bad owns them, has conquered them, at least for the time being. Should we still want the good things to be good things, even though they're being used for them, perhaps exploited by them? So he says, I happen to think of all those places in Europe I know well. It's a magnificent land, molded by suffering and history. And I'll just give you a few of these. We don't have to go through the entire thing. You can read them in the text. The roses in the cloisters of Florence in Italy, the gilded bulbous domes of Krakow in Poland, the contorted statues of the Charles Bridge at that time Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic, the delicate gardens of Salzburg in Austria, which it was one of the first things that the Nazis took over from Germany, right? So he says, all these flowers and stones, these hills and landscapes, my memory has fused together such superimposed images to make a single face, which is the face of my true native land. Camus is saying, I am a European. I am not just a Frenchman or, an Algerian Frenchman. I am a European. All of these things are part of my homeland, a genuine homeland. Now, what should he think when the Nazis control them? He says, it never occurred to me someday we would have to liberate these from you. And in moments of rage and despair, I'm occasionally sorry that the roses continue to grow in the cloister of San Marco and the pigeons drop in clusters from the cathedral of Salzburg and the red geraniums grow tirelessly in the little cemeteries of Silesia. So that's one possible response, to say, well, if somebody who doesn't deserve these has them, it would be better if they didn't exist at all anymore. And then he says, that's not the right attitude. At other moments, and he says, these are the only ones that count, I delight in this. All those landscapes, those flowers, those plowed fields, show you every spring there are some things you cannot choke in blood. Life continues on. Goodness continues on. And he says, it would not be enough for me to think that all the great shades of the West and that 30 nations were on our side. I could not do without the soil. And I know that everything in Europe, both landscape and spirit, calmly negates you without feeling any rash hatred, but only the calm strength of victory. So you Nazis who want to dominate everything, reduce everything to tools for yourself, you're not able to do that with the earth. You're not able to do that with these things, these beauties, these wonderful things that we encounter. And he says, the weapons the European spirit can use against you are the same as reside in this soil, constantly reawakening in blooms and harvests. Now he's going to conclude with something really important. He's not going to say, well, we are in this, white hat versus black hat thing. We beat the bad guys, and now everything is wonderful ever after. He says instead, all will not be over when you're crushed. Europe will still have to be established. And actually, I kind of like the way that the original French phrases this. Encore à faire. So established is okay as a translation. To be made is more literal. And this encore, it can mean it was never made, it was never established, it was only halfway done. We need to do it again more in the future, right? We need to finish it. But it can also mean we need to do it again. We need to draw upon, as he talked about, this tradition, right? The 20 centuries of this adventure of the human spirit. So there's two sides to this. And he says it always has to be established, but at least it will still be Europe. In other words, what I have written you, this other conception, a non-reductive, a non-exploitative conception of Europe. And he says, just imagine what we are now, sure of our reasons, in love with our country, carried along by all Europe, and neatly balanced between sacrifice and our longing for happiness, between the sword, l'épée, and the spirit. And he says, this is where our superiority, that it says in the English translation, that will crush you. It's literally that will kill you, kill Nazism, is coming from. So two very different conceptions of Europe, of what it is to belong to a homeland of some sort, being contrasted very starkly in Camus' third letter.